Okay, so we are going to wrap up the central nervous system today with the spinal cord. And the spinal cord isn't a very long lecture. I did go ahead and actually include um, a little bit of crossover into the peripheral nervous system, and that's actually why, even though the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, it's hard to talk about the spinal cord without talking about the peripheral nervous system. So I put this lecture in the peripheral nervous system lectures because there's a lot of crossover. So again, the spinal cord we're going to talk about is obviously in the central nervous system, but all these spinal nerves that are going to be coming out are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. And so again, there's so much crossover between, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system here, and it gets kind of muddy. But again, technically, what we consider to be the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system are going to be these motor and sensory nerves, right? But these motor and sensory nerves are going to be coming to and going from, right, the spinal cord itself. So again, that is why I kind of typically include this. And I actually went ahead and included reflexes in this as well, because it's part of the, peripheral nervous system, but it includes the spinal cord. So I just felt like it belonged in this lecture. So again, if you're having trouble and you're confused on what's the part of the central nervous system and what's part of the peripheral nervous system, just always go really basic. Spinal cord, brain, central nervous system. Everything else, peripheral. It's peripheral. It's outside of the central nervous system. It's peripheral nervous system. So the spinal cord has a couple different functions. It's going to have these spinal cord reflexes that we're going to talk about, which are actually a lot of fun. I tried to include some cool GIFs and images so that you could see some of these reflexes. We're going to talk about the fact that it's really important for integration. So it's, again, going to take in excitatory, inhibitory neurons. Summation is going to occur in these integrative neurons, the association neurons. And then again, motor input will be put out from there, depending upon what's happening again with the summation of these inhibitory and excitatory neurons. Whoever wins, right? Whoever wins the battle. If there's more inhibitory versus excitatory, then again, that pathway will be inhibited. If there's more excitatory than there is inhibitory, then that pathway will be excited. Okay, so pretty basic there. Then the spinal cord also acts as a highway, right, for the up and downward movement of sensory, obviously sensory going up, right, into the brain, and then motor, again, coming out or descending. And we actually call these tracks. Remember, it's tracks, not nerves, but bundles of these axons that are going in the same direction. We call them tracks. So we have ascending tracks, which are going to be our sensory tracks going to the brain. And then descending tracks are going to be our motor tracks, right, that are moving out and towards effectors. Okay. So hopefully that's pretty, I think those terms have been introduced enough now that you're probably pretty comfortable with them. When we look at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, we're going to look at a couple of things. Again, the spinal cord is going to begin at the foramen magnum. So again, as you go from medulla oblongata to spinal cord, you're like, where does it technically become the spinal cord? At the foramen magnum. That's where it becomes spinal cord. Okay. And then the spinal cord actually, believe it or not, ends at in between your L1 and L2 vertebra. So we'll talk about this, and then there are just spinal nerves that kind of extend off of that. I'll show you that in just a minute. Obviously, again, we already talked about functions, provides two-way communication, sensory and motor, again, to and from the brain. And it also has these major reflexes that we're going to talk about. So reflexes are kind of cool because a lot of these reflexes are where sensory is coming into the spinal cord, hitting maybe, an integrative neuron, and then the motors going right back out without ever having to go all the way to the brain. So these reflexes are pretty cool. And this is one of the reasons why our reflexes are so fast, because again, information doesn't have to be sent to the brain. It goes right through the spinal cord. So we'll talk about these soon. A lot of fun to talk about reflexes. Real quick, just to look at some anatomy here. Again, here you can see, here would be the, foramen magnum at the base of the cranium here, and that's the start of the spinal cord. If you look here, the very first spinal nerve, which will be C1, is actually going to come out above the first vertebra here. Okay, so that's the C1 vertebra. So you'll actually see you end up having 8 cervical nerves instead of 7 because you have one come out on top, right? And you have one below each of the cervical vertebra. Where do those spinal nerves come out? This is where it will be helpful for you to remember a little bit of that anatomy way back when we talked about the skeleton. Remember when we talked about the vertebra and we talked about that intervertebral foramen? When the 2 vertebrae were together, there was a hole on each side. That was for those spinal nerves. So these spinal nerves are coming out of those intervertebral foramen right here. As you look, you can see again, you've got your cervical spinal nerves here, and we'll talk about, you have 8 of them. And then you're actually going to have a cervical enlargement here where you have a lot of motor and sensory coming to and from in this area. So you kind of have a thickening of the spinal cord in that area. And then you're going to see you're going to have these 12 spinal nerves, thoracic spinal nerves. Again, you'll see that again, you've got them coming to and from, and we'll talk about that and what that looks like in detail. We'll kind of zoom in on the sensory and motor coming in. And then you'll see you're going to have your lumbar spinal nerves, and then you also have this lumbar enlargement here. And then right around L1, remember in between L1 and L2, you're going to see the end of the actual spinal cord. And it's going to end in this kind of a cone-shaped structure that we call the conus medullaris. So the conus medullaris is actually the end here of the spinal cord. And then here, down here, you're going to see this is the cauda equina. Cauda equina. And the cauda equina, cauda means tail. If you've ever heard the term caudal, we use it in marine biology all the time for like the caudal fin, it's the tail fin. So cauda means tail. And obviously equine means horse. So when anatomists first looked at this structure way back when, they thought it looked like the tail of a horse. So that's how it got its name, cauda equina. And then at the very end here, you're going to see there is going to be this structure coming off called the filum terminal. And so it's going to be this nerve that kind of comes down here, and it's going to attach to the coccyx, and it will actually kind of help anchor the spinal cord in place. Okay, and that's the filum terminal. So you'll see, I'll talk about all this in just a minute, but I want to just show you what this looks like here. And then, of course, you're going to have the 3 different meningeal layers. The dura and arachnoid mater here are going to be, on the more periphery here in terms of your meninges. And then the pia mater is going to be right around the spinal cord. And that space in between the arachnoid and the pia mater right here is called the subarachnoid space. Now that subarachnoid space, just like in the brain, is going to be filled with, you got it, cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. So a lot of things, again, in common with the brain in terms of the fact that it's still part of the central nervous system. So again, when we talk about protection for the spinal cord, just like the brain, we have bone protecting it. We have, which is the vertebra now. We've got the meninges. So again, you have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And you have cerebral spinal fluid that's in that subarachnoid space. Okay. And when we talk about the epidural space, this epidural space is going to be just like it sounds. It's epi's above, right? And dura is the dura mater. So it's going to be this space right above the dura mater. That's not depicted well. Let me see if I can find where it's depicted. So here you go. It would be, well, no, not really depicted here either, is it? Because you have, but there's a space right between here, right above the dura mater here, that's going to have a layer of like fat around it. And I'll show you, there is a cross section somewhere where I have this, where I can show you this a little better. Let me see if I can jump ahead. Here we go. So here is the epidural space right here. And that epidural space is going to contain fat and blood vessels. So there's that right above epidural right above the duramater, okay? And that epidural space is going to have fat. It's going to contain blood vessels, which is why we're going to talk about when you get an epidural, why it's given there. Again, so it's a cushion of fat, network of veins, in the space between the vertebra and the duramater. So again, this provides a little extra cushioning and protection for the spinal cord. Just like we talked about, that cerebral spinal fluid, just like it did in the brain, is going to fill that subarachnoid space. Sub being below, arachnoid. So below the arachnoid, that space below the arachnoid mater, in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. And when we talk about doing a lumbar puncture, because the dura and the arachnoid mater, they actually extend all the way to the sacrum, even though the spinal cord actually ends at L1 or L2. Remember, in between L1 or L2. This allows us kind of the perfect site to be able to do a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap and tap into this area below L2, right? So that way then we can actually look at the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, obviously, we don't want to puncture the spinal cord in any way, shape, or form, right? We don't want to damage that spinal cord. So it's just too risky to go, again, above L2. So when we're looking at doing lumbar punctures, it's going to be either between L3 and L4. So here, or between L4 and L5. Again, those are between the vertebra, the lumbar vertebra 3 and 4, or between 4 and 5. And that way then, you know you're in the safe zone, okay? You do have spinal nerves there, so you don't want to puncture a bunch of spinal nerves, but at least you know you're not going to puncture the spinal cord. And usually, again, I've seen this done because I did clinical research for multiple sclerosis. So I've watched many lumbar punctures, and most of the nurses and doctors, they say that as soon as you push that needle in, you can actually kind of feel it kind of pop into that subarachnoid space. So you know again, obviously you have to be very good at that kind of feel, but they can feel when they hit that subarachnoid space. And then all they're going to do again is draw out that cerebral spinal fluid. Now, an epidural is obviously very different than a lumbar puncture, although people get these mixed up. So an epidural is going into the epidural space. And this is actually, I like the term epidural anesthesia versus just epidural, because epidural is just telling you where it is. Again, when they do epidural anesthesia, they're going to give kind of a local anesthetic. It's going to be deposited in the epidural space. Remember, there's lots of blood vessels and stuff there. And what this is going to do is this anesthesia here, that kind of local anesthetic, is going to actually block the spinal nerve roots in that area. And it'll also block some of the sympathetic nerves that are traveling. We'll talk about these different roots, the anterior roots and the posterior roots, in just a minute. And so what it's going to do is it's basically kind of like a nerve block, and they're going to do it in an area where it's going to block against sensation kind of from the belly button down. And what's kind of interesting is there is a kind of a range of the kind of sensory that can use different drugs, basically anesthetics, to cause just some sensory analgesia where you just kind of have like you're numbing the sensation a little bit, to where you can have complete motor and sensory blocks for the area. So they can use different drugs to kind of taper what kind of anesthetic they want. So pretty cool in terms of epidurals. Now, this is just kind of showing you, I like this because this is actually a cadaver section. So I like to show you what things actually look like in a cadaver. Of course, it's cleaned off, so you can't see. They cleaned off all the fat and all that, so you don't see the epidural space here. So epidural space would be up right here. In here. Oh, they actually mark it. So there would be a bunch of fat and blood vessels right here in the epidural space. That means this here is going to be the duramater as well as the arachnoid mater. You can't really separate. It's really hard to separate the duramater and the arachnoid mater. They kind of stick together a little bit. So here's the duramater and the arachnoid mater kind of stuck together here. And then right below here is going to be that subarachnoid space where the cerebral spinal fluid is. And then here is the actual spinal cord. Now the spinal cord's actually anchored in place, kind of held in place with these ligaments here. So that'll help to kind of hold it in place. And then again, it's got that cerebral spinal fluid that's kind of buffering it as well. And then you'll see here, these are going to be the spinal nerves that are going to be coming to and from. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about in a minute the different roots, the anterior roots and the posterior roots, and what's in each of those in just a minute. So pretty cool stuff. When you do, so this is what I used to get to see quite a bit of, was these lumbar punctures or spinal taps. When they do these lumbar punctures or spinal taps, they can look for all different types of things. But one of the main reasons that they will do them, especially in hospitals, is to look for inflammation. And that's because typically, again, if there's inflammation and infection in those meninges, in the layer of the meninges, especially, again, something called meningitis, where you have inflammation of the meninges. Usually meningitis, that inflammation of the meninges is due to an infection, a bacterial infection. And so what that will do is that will cause the cerebral spinal fluid to be pretty cloudy. Now remember, normally cerebral spinal fluid is crystal clear, and I am talking clear. Like you can't tell the difference between cerebral spinal fluid and like really pure water. I mean, it's just that crystal clear. So this is really cloudy. Like this is super bad. You never want to see again cerebral spinal fluid like this. So that's again oftentimes why they do lumbar punctures. And again, you know, if you have inflammation due to multiple sclerosis and some attacks on the spinal cord itself, then it will also oftentimes show up in that cerebral spinal fluid. That inflammation will show up there. Okay, so when we look again at these different parts, I know I already went through these, but you can look through this in terms of that conus medullaris. That's that cone-shaped structure. Again, this is where the spinal cord ends. The filum terminal are going to be these little fibrous extensions that, and they're really hard because sometimes when we tag them on maps, or in models, they're really hard to identify. Sorry, I said I think maps, but I meant like maps of like the nerves. It's really hard to identify. So we'll always tag them at the bottom, and we'll always tag it where it's actually attaching to the coccyx. So that way then you know it's the filum terminal. So again, look for that on the models. You will have to identify these terms for lab. And then for lecture, I just want you to know what they are. So again, the filum terminal is really going to anchor the spinal cord. That's its purpose, okay? These cervical and lumbar enlargements that I'll show you in just a minute are going to be areas where nerves that are kind of going to and from the upper limb, so obviously upper limb would be cervical, and then the lower limbs are going to be lumbar, are going to have these kind of bulges because there's so many nerves going to and from, again, the upper limb and then the lower limbs in these areas. So your cervical enlargement will be the upper limbs, and the lumbar enlargement will be the lower limbs coming in. The cauda equina, of course, is that horse's tail. Again, we have the collection of those nerve roots that are coming in, that are below the spinal cord and then coming in up to the spinal cord. So again, I always love the name. I like horses. So cauda equina is one of my favorite names. And we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So again, you can see here, this is going to show you the cervical enlargement for the upper limb, and then the lumbar enlargement for the lower limbs. And here you can see, again, they're just showing you what, again, some of this, this is part of the cervical spinal cord, and then they're showing you like, here's the actual cervical enlargement, which is kind of cool. So you can actually see how it kind of bulges out there. And then you can see the nerves coming to and from the spinal cord here. So that's always cool. And then you can actually see, we're going to talk about these in just a minute, but you can actually see these dorsal root ganglions So check those out because I'm going to show you what those are in a minute. But cool, this is a dissection. Whoever did this was amazing, obviously. But very cool that you can see these dorsal root ganglions. And then again, this is just part of the thoracic spinal cord. And then here you can see, this is what I really wanted you to see, the very inferior portion of the spinal cord that shows you this conus medullaris, the cauda equina, and then you can even see this structure right here is the filum terminal. So kind of cool. It's really easy to see it right at the end of it coming off here. And that'll anchor the spinal cord. So again, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. They're gonna match our vertebra other than the cervical nerves. So remember we said, when you were learning the vertebra, you could remember breakfast, lunch, dinner. So it was 7, 12, and 5. You can still remember that, but just remember there's one extra cervical nerve because it comes out above on top of that first cervical vertebra. So we actually have 8 pairs of cervical nerves, and then everything else is the same. 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, and then you actually have some sacral nerves coming off of there as well. So again, the 5 fused vertebrae for the sacrum, you have 5 pairs of sacral nerves. So kind of cool. And then 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. So I always think that's nice and easy to remember. The only one that's different really is that cervical one. And then again, maybe the coccyx because you remember that it was, like 3 bones fused together. But again, you can it's easy to remember. There's just 1 pair of coccygeal nerves, pretty easy. Now these nerves are mixed sensory and motor nerves, and I'll show you as they come into the spinal cord how they're separated, the sensory from the motor. So here it is. This is a cross section of the spinal cord, and this is where the magic happens. So this is where the spinal nerve is going to come in and from, I should say, to the spinal cord. Now, the spinal nerve itself is right here. It starts right here. And that's because, again, it's going to be a mix of motor and sensory, okay? Now, when this separates, as again, it comes into, and here you're gonna see out of, right, the spinal cord, this is where we're gonna separate them out into talking about the roots of the spinal nerve. So this here is going to be the anterior root, okay? Or sometimes you'll also hear it called the ventral root. And then this is going to be called the posterior or dorsal root. Okay, now this dorsal root is how you are going to orient yourself for a lab. It's how I orient myself with everything associated with the spinal cord. Okay, because if you know that this ganglion here, and it's only on the dorsal root or posterior root. So I'm going to use both terms just so you know, dorsal and posterior are the same thing, remember? So that's why you'll see it here marked as posterior or in parentheses dorsal root ganglion. Now, you're going to hear in a lot of clinical settings, they're more likely to use dorsal root ganglion. It's just kind of like a, again, more traditional term that was used. And then kind of the newbies will use posterior root ganglion. So you really should know both. Obviously, again, I will make sure to put both on an exam. So here are those posterior or dorsal root ganglions. And the reason that you have these ganglions is, remember those sensory neurons that are coming in? Those sensory neurons are unipolar. And so here you can see sensory neuron, again, bringing in nerve sensations from the body, coming in through the spinal nerve, and then it branches off as it comes in through the spinal nerve. Eventually it will branch off into this dorsal root or posterior root. And that's where you're going to see this ganglion, because remember, these unipolar neurons look like this, okay? And they have these cell bodies, and then, again, the cell body is kind of hanging out off the side of the axon. And so that ends up where you have all of these sensory neurons coming in. You have all of these cell bodies, and I mean, you're like talking about 100 cell bodies are hanging out right here, or hundreds of cell bodies are hanging out right here. So that's what forms this bulge that we call the ganglion. Remember, ganglion is a grouping of those cell bodies. So That only happens in our sensory neurons here, not in the motor neurons. This takes us back a few lectures here. But because it only happens, then we only have these root ganglions on the sensory side, which is the dorsal or posterior side. So the great part is all you have to do is find that dorsal root ganglion, and boom, you know that this half of the spinal cord right here is the posterior side to the back. Okay, that means everything here is towards the front, anterior or ventral. Okay, that's the beauty. Now, again, the other thing is if you know that those dorsal root ganglions are because you have sensory neurons that are unipolar, then you know that the posterior everything on the spinal cord is going to be more associated with sensory coming in. And the ventral side is going to be more associated with motor neurons going out. Okay? So again, here your spinal nerves begin as roots. The dorsal or posterior root, again, is incoming sensory fibers, okay, bringing in nerve impulses from sensations out in the body to, again, the spinal cord. And we have that dorsal root ganglion, which is our grouping of cell bodies. Then we have the ventral or anterior root that's going to be bringing all motor neurons coming out, okay? And then the point where these two come together, the, again, dorsal root or the posterior root, and then the anterior ventral root, where they come together here is what's called the spinal nerve. So hopefully that will all make sense to you now. It's really confusing when you're looking at them in lab and you don't know what the purpose of them is. And once you know the purpose of them, it's infinitely easier to understand how to orient yourself. Okay, so when we look at the grooves that run on the spinal cord that divide it into the right and left halves. And again, we'll talk about I'll remind you of the crossover degustation that actually happens up in the, for motor especially, that's going to happen up in the medulla oblongata. But so you're going to have, again, these right halves, and you're going to have tracks running in the right and the left halves, okay? And they're going to be separated by what's called the ventral or anterior median fissure, and then the dorsal or posterior median sulcus. I know, why don't they just call them both sulcus? I don't know why. I guess because when I show you an actual cross-section through a cadaver here, you'll see that this anterior sulcus is actually quite a little bit bigger. So anterior fissure is quite a bit bigger. So that's why they call it the anterior median fissure. So this is the anterior median fissure right here. And then here is the posterior median sulcus, median for the middle. So again, let me see if I can show you. There's a better here. So this is a little bit easier to see why in an actual cadaver section. You can see kind of why it's called a fissure here. It's just a smaller, much smaller opening here. So they call it in the posterior median sulcus versus anterior median fissure because it's so much larger in that anterior side. But that's what's going to separate the right and left halves. But it won't go all the way through, and there is going to be this little area in between of white matter as well as gray matter that's going to connect the right and left halves. And we're going to call that the commissure, just like we did in the brain where we had, again, the tracks running through that were connecting the right and left halves. We called those commissural. So we're going to use that same term, commissure. But now here you'll have like your anterior white commissure, posterior white commissure, and then you have your anterior gray commissure for the gray matter, posterior gray commissure, again, for the gray matter. So I'll show you all that in just a minute, but I like to kind of introduce that so that you can see why we have those. And that's just connecting, again, the right and left halves. So I think, yeah, we talked all about that. Again, that gray matter is going to be located at, just like we talked about, kind of traditional for the central nervous system, that gray matter will be located in the core, white matter on the outside. And then the central canal is going to run smack dab in the middle of the cord, and it's going to be filled with that cerebral spinal fluid. So again, here is going to be that central canal, with the central canal with the cerebral spinal fluid. And then you're going to have the gray matter here, the gray matter core. Then you have your surrounding white matter here. And then again, you've got your spinal nerves coming in and out that are going to branch into your dorsal root and your anterior root. Here's your anterior root, here's your dorsal root, and you can see that dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so hopefully that'll kind of orient you pretty well. You should be comfortable by the time you get to lab with all this after lecture. And again, you can see this is just another depiction of this. So spinal nerves, again, coming in here, branches into the dorsal root ganglion that's bringing sensory in. Motor is coming out through that ventral root, okay? And here's that, again, white matter, gray matter, central canal with the cerebral spinal fluid. And then you can see here, they're going to break up this white matter and gray matter that we're going to talk about into different horns for gray matter and then different columns for the white matter. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then this one's nice because this does remind you that you've got this it shows you the subarachnoid space and then the arachnoid duramater, and then you can see the epidural space. So it kind of gives you a big overview of everything. So let's talk about the gray matter of the spinal cord. So the gray matter of the spinal cord, forms this really beautiful shaped butterfly. I like to think of it as a butterfly. Some people call it the letter H, but to me it looks like this nice, pretty butterfly. And remember that the gray matter is where you're going to find your cell bodies, and then you're going to find some unmyelinated axons and dendrites. So you can find cell bodies, dendrites, and a few unmyelinated axons. Again, they're going to be paired. So you're going to have dorsal and ventral horns. Okay. So here's going to be the, or posterior. So you can use posterior and anterior. So you've got posterior gray horn, or again, you can call it the dorsal gray horn, and then the ventral or the anterior gray horn. Okay. And then here's your anterior median fissure and your posterior median sulcus there. Okay. So hopefully this is going to help you out quite a bit with lab. And then when you're looking at this gray matter butterfly, right? This little central portion that connects the wings or the horns, technically. The wings of the butterfly, but technically, since they're called the horns here, connecting the horns in the middle here is going to be your gray commissure, okay? And so you're going to have, again, the posterior gray commissure right here that's connecting the right and left halves behind the central canal. And then you have this little section where you have the anterior gray commissure that's going to be in front of that, that central canal, okay? And oh, just as a reminder, the central canal, remember, is continuous to that fourth ventricle of the brain, where, again, the cerebral spinal fluid's being made, and on up, again, in the ventricles of the brain there. So when we look at that gray matter, again, we have dorsal or posterior horns, ventral or anterior horns, and then we have these lateral horns. And the beauty of it is, again, if you remember that dorsal and posterior is sensory, then this is easy. The dorsal horns are going to be these interneurons that are receiving sensory information, both somatic sensory, which is, again, the sensory that's going to your body, like to your skin and things like that. And then also visceral sensory input. Again, visceral being sensory input that's coming from your organs. Okay. So again, dorsal horns are all about sensory. Ventral or anterior horns are going to be all about motor. So again, these are going to be interneurons bringing in somatic motor neurons, as well as we'll see some visceral motor neurons. So again, these are going to be motor neurons that are going out to like your skeletal muscles, and motor neurons that's somatic, and the motor neurons that are going out again to your organs. And then the lateral horns, which are really only in your thoracic and then your superior lumbar regions. They're just kind of in these thoracic and upper lumbar regions. And this is going to be for your sympathetic neurons. So that's where we're going to find your sympathetic neurons. And remember that sympathetic system is your fight or flight system. Then our gray commissure is going to be that bridge, again, of gray matter that's connecting the left and the right. Okay, so again, we have the anterior and posterior gray commissures. So, oops, I think I just went backwards there. So this is kind of cool because again, you can see this, right? So here's this dorsal root ganglion. So immediately when you see that dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion, again, you should immediately think sensory. Okay, so this part here is sensory. So here you've got somatic sensory coming from the body and then visceral sensory coming from the organs. Now, here, when you look on this one, this is your ventral root because there's no ganglion or anterior root. Immediately, you should think motor. So you have, again, somatic motor coming from, motor neurons going to the skeletal muscles of the body. And then here, you have visceral motor neurons, again, going to your organs. And again, this is, if you picture, this is in those lateral horns a lot of times because those lateral horns will be associated with your kind of fight or flight sympathetic autonomic neurons. And so that's going to be sending, again, that motor neuron information to your body to increase heart rate because you're running from the scary bear or something like that, okay? Because those are going to be your sympathetic autonomic motor neurons. So kind of cool that you can kind of see all this come together. But again, super basic if you can remember, posterior dorsal is sensory, anterior's motor, okay? So white matter. White matter, again, is going to be our myelinated and then some non-myelinated, but mostly myelinated, right? Because that's why it looks white, nerve fibers. That's going to allow communication. This is where we're going to have these big tracks, communication between parts of the spinal cord and the brain, the higher areas of the brain, right? Because it's going to be bringing in information up to the brain. And so you're going to see these, we're going to have tracks that are running in 3 different directions, of course. We're going to have the ascending ones that are bringing sensory information up to the brain. We're going to have descending ones that are bringing, again, information from the brain to the spinal cord and then out through the nerves through motor outputs. And then we are going to have the transverse ones that are the Kamishura fibers that are connecting the right and left halves of the spinal cord. So here again, you can see where we break this up into, and you're like, you may look at this and we have, if we have it tagged on a practical, you're like, oh, what column? And remember, we call these big chunks of white matter in the spinal cord columns. So you might be like, I can't remember which column this is. Is this anterior, posterior? Look for this guy. Boom, you immediately see that dorsal root ganglion. This is the dorsal or posterior column, okay? So there's your dorsal or posterior column. That means this is your anterior or ventral column. And then here's your lateral column, okay? So that's the nice part is, again, that dorsal root ganglion just makes things so easy. So as you look, of course, again, very typical, posterior end here is going to be mostly sensory. And then you've got motor neurons up here. Again, mostly motor neurons here in the more ventral or anterior, I should say motor tracts, because we've got big tracts coming through here. So most of the motor tracts are coming through the ventral or anterior column here, and then some in the lateral, okay? So, and then you can see some sensory in the lateral, little bit of sensory. You do not have to, just so you know, you do not have to identify the different ones. I just want you to know again that overall, many of the sensory tracts are going to be coming in these posterior columns. Many of the motor tracts are going to be in these anterior ventral columns because that's everything, right, for the spinal cord. So that's the beauty of it. So again, this is just showing you some of those major areas. And then you can see here, I just liked this because it kind of shows I put this back up here again so you can see the different horns of the gray matter as well. So again, just to review, when you look at the gray matter, you have the dorsal horns here, the lateral horns here, and then the ventral horns here. And then remember again that these are sensory here, this is going to be kind of your autonomic here, and then here is going to be your motor, okay? in the ventral horn. And then again, you've got your columns here. So you've got your posterior columns, or again, you can call it posterior or dorsal. Here's your lateral column, and then here's going to be your ventral or anterior column. Okay, so pretty easy so far. I say that, I know it's easy for me because I've seen it a lot. I know that it's challenging with you, but it will get easier as you see it in lab and lecture. So interesting things with spinal cord, of course, is talk about trauma and disorders of the spinal cord. So there's spinal cord trauma, of course. You guys have probably heard of lots of cases of spinal cord trauma. You may even know someone that's had spinal cord trauma if they've had, been in a car accident where they received injury to their spinal cord. Or you may know someone that has a disease that's affected their spinal cord. So again, spinal cord trauma is considered a localized injury to the spinal cord or the spinal roots that are leading to some type of functional loss. And there are two kind of major terms that we use with spinal cord trauma. There's paresthesia, which is going to be damage to the dorsal root. So if it's damage to the dorsal root, it is damage to sensory, right? So this is going to be a loss of sensory function. So paresthesia comes out in different ways. You guys have probably all felt like temporary paresthesia if you've pinched again blood flow to the nerve in an area, like you sat in your foot for a long time and you get the kind of tingling and numbness. That was kind of temporary paresthesia. But again, obviously, if you have spinal cord trauma, you can have permanent damage to those areas, and you can have permanent loss of sensory to that area. And a lot of times, again, initially, the brain can't process that sudden loss of sensory. So sometimes it will come out feeling like you have bugs crawling all over you in that area, because again, your brain's just trying to figure out how to process all of a sudden this sudden loss of sensory input to that area of the brain. So it can come out, that paresthesia can kind of come out in different forms, tingling, numbness, or this feeling that you have this crawling sensation of bugs. People say I've had MS patients that have had this, and they said it feels like there's spiders crawling underneath your skin. So that's that expression of that loss of sensory. And then, of course, paralysis is going to be damage to the ventral roots or the ventral horn. And remember, ventral is motor. So here you have a loss of motor function. So that loss of motor function can be considered either flaccid paralysis or spastic. And so here's a spinal cord injury actually to the cervical region, and you can see the vertebrae is actually puncturing the spinal cord here. And so again, if that happens in that ventral horn, especially, or that ventral root, then you're going to see paralysis. Now, flaccid paralysis is where you've had really severe damage to the ventral root or ventral horn, and this results in no voluntary or involuntary control of the muscles in that area. So impulses cannot reach those muscles. And this is where you see, depending upon the type of paralysis and the injury we'll talk about in just a minute, you can see quadriplegia and paraplegia from this type of flaccid paralysis. Now, and then you'll see muscles will atrophy because they're not getting any innervation to those muscles, so they're not contracting anymore, and the muscles will just start to break down and atrophy. Now, spastic paralysis is where you have damage to your upper motor neurons in the primary motor cortex. And this means that your spinal neurons are actually intact, but the muscles are stimulated still by reflex activities through the spinal cord. So spastic paralysis really happens when you have damage to the kind of upper motor neurons. So flaccid paralysis is what you see in spinal cord injury. But I just wanted to bring up spastic paralysis since we were talking about flaccid paralysis. So again, this is not again necessarily due to spinal cord trauma. It's just it kind of went well with this. So again, there's no voluntary control of muscles, but there is involuntary control. So there's reflexes. You still have reflex activities that will go just through the spinal cord and not through the brain. And so sometimes what ends up happening is these muscles contract, kind of, they're overly stimulated, and they can actually end up, the muscles can cause, like, you can get kind of tremors, or the muscles will just shorten permanently. And that's what you're seeing here in this individual. A lot of times you see this in stroke patients. Okay. And so again, they have this kind of like shortened muscle contracted state that you see them in. That's more spastic paralysis. But again, flaccid paralysis is really what's associated with spinal cord injuries. And so let's talk about some of the different cases of flaccid paralysis. So you can, depending upon where you have, again, that injury to the spinal cord, it will determine what type of, obviously, functional loss you have. The higher up, obviously, is much more damaging than, lower in the spinal cord. So paraplegia typically happens when you have transection, like severe damage to the spinal cord in between the T1 and L1 vertebra. So again, this is between the thoracic 1 vertebra and then the lumbar 1 vertebra. And that oftentimes will cause, if you have, again, a severe injury that kind of cuts through or transects through the spinal cord, then this will result in paraplegia. Paraplegia, again, is where you have paralysis below the chest and you have loss of function, motor function, again, to the legs. Now, quadriplegia, it would be if you have any injury that transects the spinal cord in the cervical region. And that will, again, result in what we call quadriplegia or tetraplegia. And that just means that, again, you're losing motor function to all 4 limbs now, okay? So those are just different spinal cord injuries. And then spinal shock is typically what we see. I see this in multiple sclerosis patients, or used to when I did clinical research, where they would have this kind of transient period of functional loss that was just below a lesion. So let's say they would have an attack on the spinal cord, right? Because it's an autoimmune disease, in the L10 region here. And so they would see kind of some functional loss, temporary functional loss, to, again, the regions below that lesion. So again, the spinal nerves that would innervate the regions below that, they would see some temporary functional loss, but usually they regain a lot of that back, okay? So it's just kind of like a kind of temporary functional loss, or to what we call transient functional loss. Now, poliomyelitis is kind of interesting. We don't really see polio anymore because we have vaccines for polio, but you do see it in some of these countries that don't have the vaccination programs that we are so lucky to have here in the United States. But polio, again, is going to be a condition where you have destruction by the virus to the ventral horn, the ventral motor horns, or ventral motor neurons. And so this is going to be loss of motor function. So you're going to see loss of motor function. Muscles are going to atrophy because you're not getting the motor innervation to those muscles. Death can occur if, again, there's damage to the ventral horn and those neurons that would actually innervate things like the diaphragm that help you breathe, okay? Or, again, muscles going to the heart. So obviously, again, polio was a very severe virus. And the survivors of polio often developed what we call post-polio syndrome, where they had, many years later, they still had loss of motor function. So a lot of times they, couldn't walk without some assistance and things like that. So again, we don't see polio today because, of course, we're lucky to have vaccines here in the United States. Also, I just want to talk really quickly about Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And you don't have to know that, but I might ask you about Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. And this is, again, going to be destruction of the ventral horn motor neurons, and then also the pyramidal tracts that are running, again, through those motor tracts that are running through the ventral column, white column. And so you can get destruction of those motor tracts. And of course, this can cause loss of motor function, loss of ability to speak, swallow, and even breathe. Typically, death will occur, unfortunately, in individuals within 5 years of kind of identifying some of the disease and the disease progression that's occurring. And we don't really understand why, or what causes ALS. We know that there's a genetic component, and there are genetic mutations that we see involving RNA processing in these neurons, but we don't exactly know what causes it. And usually there's some type of environmental trigger, just like there is for many of the autoimmune diseases. But again, we don't really understand what that environmental trigger is. Now, we also know that, remember, glutamate, that excitatory, this is a little more than you have to know, but that glutamate, that excitatory neurotransmitter, oftentimes, again, so as some of these neurons start to break down, we get that big rush of glutamate, and then the glutamate like overexcites these neurons. And so basically it's like, if you've ever had like something that you cracked, and then, but you're like, no, I need to keep using it, and it cracks more and it cracks more. So that's kind of a good example of what's happening with glutamate excitotoxicity. So basically, you have a neuron and it's already damaged, and then all of a sudden you get this big release of glutamate, and they're like, no, let's excite this neuron, even though it's already damaged. Now it's excited, it's causing it to like break down even more as it's trying to, repair itself. It doesn't have a chance to. And again, when you're talking about neurons in the central nervous system, again, we just don't get that repair. We don't see that. So what's interesting is the drugs that they're using, one of the main drugs to treat ALS actually interferes with glutamate signaling to help prevent that kind of glutamate excitotoxicity. I'm not going to get this detailed on an exam, but I just like to present it in case you know someone with ALS. It might explain why they're on this treatment. There's also a new drug that they're using that scavenges free radicals, because they believe that free radical destruction is part of the progression of ALS. So there is a new drug that they're using for that as well. Those are the only two treatment options that they have right now. Of course, there's research being done on it, but let's talk about neuronal pathways. So again, we have these kind of four major, four key points or four key terms to know for our spinal tracts and pathways that are running up and down the spinal cord. So decussation, again, is where pathways are going to cross from one side to the other in the CNS. And this mostly happens in the medulla oblongata. But just as a reminder, again, we do have that decussation. So right side of the brain is controlling, and again, left side of the body, and vice versa. Relays are going to be these chains of 2 or 3 neurons that run through the spinal cord. And this will make sense as we talk through some of the actual reflex activities. And then remember that we do have this somatic trip. We have these kind of spatial relationships in the central nervous system that correspond to spatial relationships in the body. Again, that's kind of more going back to the brain and the homunculi. And then we do have some symmetry. So paired pathways that are on the right and the left, just innervating the opposite sides of the body. So when we look at our ascending pathways, we'll see that we have this kind of upward movement. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and stop here because I think this has gotten really long. I'm going to stop here, and then I'll do a much shorter lecture on the reflexes for you. And that way then hopefully I'm not just trying to rush through this lecture and get it out as quick as possible. So I'll go ahead and come back and then do the reflexes, which are really interesting. So don't miss the second part of this lecture because the reflexes are awesome. And then that hopefully will make this a little bit shorter for you guys.